Thank you, Mr. Chairman, colleagues from the Asahi Glass Foundation, and thank you all for coming, so many people, giving up your time today. So, communicating and combating the crisis in nature, led by the twin existential threats of climate meltdown and biodiversity collapse. This is the defining imperative of our times. These are existential threats. I've been working on this problem since the 1980s, as you heard in the video. My brief for this lecture is to distill the top learnings from my experience over these years. I've done so with the aim of connecting the takeaways that I distill, turning them into a linear narrative, and that helps build a beacon for hope of the kind Rob described in his lecture, appropriate for our times, with which to end the lecture. So there have been 5 phases in my vocational life, all variously relevant to the crisis in nature. I began as an earth scientist, as you heard, on the faculty at the Royal School of Mines from 1978 to 1989. My research was on the geological history of our planet, and I often worked in Japan with Japanese geologists. Some of them I'm privileged to have in the audience today. I drilled off Japan with Japanese and international scientists on the drill ship you see in the picture, scientific drill ship, not oil drill ship, that you see in the picture, the Glomar Challenger. My research on the geological histories of the oceans led to a deep and early concern about climate meltdown. I'm sad to say that hasn't gone away. I began working on climate full-time in 1989, and as such, I attended almost all the sessions of the global climate negotiations through to the Kyoto Climate Summit in 1997, where the world's governments, almost all of them, finally agreed a meaningful treaty against expectations. And we've had several of these treaties that have kept hope alive and made progress. Not enough, but progress. In 1996, I switched from campaigning in and around the negotiations and national policy making to campaigning as a businessman in a vitally relevant market. I entered the business world and set up Solar Century, a company that helped create the solar revolution and rode a rising tide of solarization in the world. In 2020, I set up Highlands Rewilding, a company that aims to help grow another vital market for a livable future, the currently very embryonic nature recovery market. So I'll now distill 20 learnings from this journey as instructed. First one is that we've had our successes. In particular, almost all the world's governments have signed nature treaties with ambitious targets. On climate meltdown, that's the Paris Agreement of 2015. It includes an ambitious target of keeping global average temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius, as everyone here will know. On biodiversity collapse, the Kunming-Montreal Framework of 2022, also signed by almost all the world's governments, includes ambitious goals of halting biodiversity collapse by 2030 and reversing it by 2045. However, broader developments in global society in the years since, these treaties have put brakes on action that is anyway consistent with the agreed targets for both governments and corporations. And the reasons for this slow progress are clearly visible in the world around us. And my next 2 learnings describe one of the biggest. For decades now, this is the sad truth. The oil and gas industry has been very innovative in the ways that has kept us locked into dependency on its products. It's basically conducted an increasingly malign rearguard action to defend its products. Compelling evidence for global overheating became particularly clear as far back as 1990, when the first scientific report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was published. It's been 35 years since then, and it's become increasingly clear, both in the scientific understanding and in the increasing physical manifestations of a climate in meltdown. But this has done little or nothing to slow the oil and gas industry's innovation in the extraction of its products and the defense of its products. For example, when I was a consultant to the industry, I researched a rock called shale, funded by BP, Shell, and other companies. Before my concerns about climate crystallized, I also explored for oil and gas. At that time, shale was a source rock where the petroleum came from by cooking of the carbon. Since then, because of the development of fracking, shale has become a source rock and a reservoir rock. And so we read of shale on the front cover of Time magazine, fully 14 years after the Kyoto Protocol was signed, and sent a clear message to the oil and gas industry that it should begin an orderly retreat from fossil fuels to clean energy, that this rock, shale, could power the world. No reference whatsoever to the sabotaging of the future in so doing. So how has the oil and gas industry managed to defend its products so ruthlessly and mercilessly? They've conducted a rearguard action rooted in disinformation, not just misinformation, but disinformation, and worse, ever since the talks began in 1990. I witnessed this close to, in and around the climate negotiations between 1990 and 2000, and chronicled what I saw in a book, The Carbon War. I subsequently wrote other books that have continued to record this sad story that I've seen. Since 2000, as the science of climate change has become ever clearer for those of us who have eyes to see, the tactics of the fossil fuel rearguard have become ever more malign. Much use has been made of the ability of the world's largest PR companies to manipulate public opinion on a massive scale. These skills have been directed towards active disinformation on the instructions of the oil companies and other elements of the fossil fuel industries. There's an abundance of evidence for this. It's not controversial, I'm afraid. Much of it confessional. In my own case, for example, I well remember a guilt-ridden senior executive in a global PR agency working for some of the biggest oil companies who told me, quotes, "They are using black arts to try and kill you." He meant my side of the false debate the PR agencies were charged with whipping up around global warming. The fossil fuel industries have not done this in isolation, however, sadly. Many politicians have helped the fossil fuel industries continue to defend the status quo, notwithstanding the mass public anguish about climate change that is common. The use of disinformation by politicians and governments in the 21st century has become so common that many people refer to the times we live in as the post-truth world. I offer one small but depressing example to make my point. The picture shows the front page of a UK newspaper from February 2015. It refers to the solution proposed by British Prime Minister to the problem of soaring energy prices. He blames the problem on the solution. Clean energy doesn't drive high prices. It didn't in 2015. Fossil fuels and nuclear do that. Use of this kind of false meme by populists has become completely routine in the post-truth world. However, despite a constant blizzard of this kind of disinformation, many people nonetheless see the truth. Opinion polls show overwhelming support for stronger government action on climate change. For example, the United Nations Development Programme's 2024 People's Climate Vote statistically represents 87% of the world population. It found that 80% of people in multiple countries want this action. This level of concern is regularly expressed in street protests, such as the International Children's Climate Strikes in recent years. The clash of belief systems involved here goes far beyond mere differences of opinion. The economic stakes, if the deniers have it wrong, are incalculable. My next learning makes that point. The capacity for nature-related denial has become breathtaking. Business reporting and electoral cycles allow mega risk to be ignored. Two examples of this. All around the world, infrastructure is being built on coastal plains, even adjacent to beaches, as though sea level rise projections from climate change and the prospect of superstorms don't exist. This includes installations capable of dire pollution impacts if flooded, such as oil refineries and nuclear power plants. Then there are the tipping points, the so-called tipping points that climate scientists worry about. The carbon bomb phenomena that hold the potential to amplify climate meltdown via feedback effects. The feedback that I personally worry about the most involves methane hydrates. Having drilled into one of them as my time as a geologist, as did one of my former colleagues in the audience today. Hydrates are ice-like solids that can trap huge amounts of gas under pressure in strata. As temperatures rise, they destabilize, releasing the gas. Communicating clear, present, and growing dangers like this is made difficult not just by the falsehoods that the incumbencies spin, but by the very structure of our brains, as my next learning describes. Sorry, I've missed the slide going forward. Communicating and combating the crisis is made more difficult by what neuroscientists have discovered about rational thinking. The task of communicating the risks we're running by slowing down policies that can meet targets for combating the crisis in nature would be difficult enough in a society where everyone engaged in rational debate that led to logical consensual outcomes. But we do not, as the researchers of neuroscientists have shown us in multiple studies this century. As Dan Ariely puts it in his seminal book, Predictable Irrationality, standard economics assumes that we are rational, but we're far less rational in our decision-making. Our irrational behaviors are neither random nor senseless. They are actually systematic and predictable. This is a sobering constraint on room to maneuver for those who seek both to defend liberal democracy and communicate and combat the crisis in nature. But thankfully, it's not universal, as the next learning describes. Rational arguments can prevail. A recent example could well pose major problems for the defenders of ruin going forward, and we have to hope that it will. In July 2025, the International Court of Justice's 15 judges unanimously ruled that governments must act with the highest ambition compatible with the Paris goal of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Crucially, liability for not doing this should attach both to a nation's own emissions and those of companies within the nation. As a result, courts worldwide will now be much less inclined to shrug off claims for damages against governments or companies that delay decarbonisation. Accordingly, crucially, investors may feel the need to be considering the threat of potential carbon liability as a much higher risk in any investment prospect. In that may well lie a vital lever in the achieving of carbon emissions. Just as the campaign that led to this ruling can inspire hope for progress through courts around the world, so can another highly successful campaign, this time in the capital markets, as my next learning recounts. This is the Carbon Tracker story. The non-government organization Carbon Tracker has had great success with the so-called carbon bubble argument by using the language of the capital markets. Carbon Tracker is a think tank of financial analysts who argue that the world's financial markets are carrying this bubble because of climate change. Their first report in 2011 demonstrated that if global heating is to be kept below 2 degrees Celsius, the remaining budget for burning carbon would be only 565 gigatons of carbon dioxide. We mapped 2,795 gigatons of carbon dioxide in total proven coal, oil, and gas reserves. That doesn't include the deposits that are being explored for at the moment. This overshoot is counted on balance sheets of companies and countries as though it's assets, but it's essentially unburnable if climate meltdown is to be combated. As such, these assets are in grave danger of becoming stranded with massive loss of value and inherent risk of a shock able to crash financial markets. In my experience, no non-government organization has ever had an impact as seismic as Carbon Tracker has had with this thesis. Fossil fuel investment, particularly for new oil and gas today, is imperiled, indeed, possibly to the point of collapsing, and we can see Carbon Tracker's footprints all over this. The next learning is a particularly important example in the history of what's been going on. Key financial sector figures, persuaded by the carbon bubble argument, played a major role in the Paris Climate Agreement. I witnessed this close to as chair of Carbon Tracker at the time. In 2013, the Bank of England rejected the carbon bubble notion. I was in the meeting where they told us why they rejected it. But by 2015, then Bank Governor Mark Carney was an evangelist for Carbon Tracker's thesis, setting up the task force on climate-related financial disclosure and inviting Carbon Tracker to present to the Financial Stability Board that he chaired. He's now the Prime Minister of Canada, of course. Carney explained the wider context of his advocacy of this thesis in 2021, addressing no less a body than the World Economic Forum. Climate change is an existential risk, and if you're solving one of those, if you're part of the solution, not the problem, it's a tremendous opportunity, as we've heard from Rob in the connection with methane. That should be an observation particularly relevant to the insurance industry. This is an industry that is particularly threatened, but failed to take opportunities to address climate risk at source for decades. Insurance industry experts have long professed that their sector faces a growing existential threat from expanding inability to insure against increasingly numerous and/or intense climate-related disasters of the kind we're seeing in the Western Atlantic today. Should climate risk not be abated globally? Yet the industry as a whole has done little to address the risk at source. In particular, investment divisions in many companies still invest in fossil fuel companies as though climate change does not exist. In the early and mid-1990s, I ran a campaign to help convey these risks to insurers and persuade them to act accordingly. In 1993, I presented a white paper to Lloyd's of London. In it, I argued, as was my experience, that in high places in the industry, there are real fears for the very future of stable insurance markets should current climate models prove accurate, or even worse, underestimates. And sadly, of course, it has. I concluded that the industry can and must look to strategic protection of its market. Some far-sighted insurers were listening at that time, but it's sad to look back on the inability to act concertedly by the industry in the interim. In 1994, the president of the Reinsurance Association of America invited me to present the case to the leaders of most of America's reinsurance companies at their annual gathering. In the subsequent 30 years, understanding of the stakes has grown. For example, the international insurance broker Howden now professes that if an asset or operation is uninsurable, it's likely to be uninvestable. Insurance is no longer just about protection, it's a barometer of the climate readiness than the long-term asset value. But in those 30 years, with global temperatures rising all the time, as the chart shows, it's a different version of the chart that Rob showed us earlier, the industry's collective efforts to protect its own interests have been dismal. This is particularly disappointing given the profitable risk abatement opportunities that have arisen along the way. And my next example is one of those. Again, one that I've seen close to. We know we're collectively capable of creating exponential markets vital to a livable future, even if they do inconveniently displace fossil fuels. And the growth of the solar photovoltaic or PV market since around 2006 is perhaps the most striking example of this. As solar manufacturing costs fell, the blue line in the chart, it's a logarithmic chart, the volume of sales rose sharply and capital from financial institutions increasingly fed the growth. This is capitalism with a survival reflex in a market vital to a livable future. The solar company I founded in 2000, Solar Century, helped create that takeoff and also rode the wave. And you can see some of the products that we installed to the right there on domestic houses and on huge retail sheds. What we need to do, learning number 12, is repeat this exponential market in the one that was created 2 decades ago in nature, and we need to do it fast. The fast-growing global solar market is a key tool in the transition away from fossil fuels, but solving climate change alone is not enough for a livable future. The interrelated risks of climate meltdown and biodiversity collapse require rapidly growing markets in both energy transition technologies like solar and in nature recovery, biodiversity recovery. The financial sector now has disclosure task forces for both climate and nature, trying to direct investment into each of these two vital markets. Potential investees among nature recovery developers, including the company I founded, Highlands, Rewilding, are working hard to create the tipping point for the nature market. The picture on the right shows an example of how we're endeavoring to do this, expanding temperate rainforest in Scotland. This is the kind of project that financial institutions must be investing in on a national scale if governments are to have any chance of hitting the ambitious targets in the Kunming-Montreal Treaty. For this to happen, it will be obvious that governments need to be bringing in policies consistent with their treaty pledges, in Paris on climate and Montreal on biodiversity. In that regard, I need to talk about the vital role of democracy and democracies in bringing this about. The sad fact is that democracy is under growing threat, and a livable planet will not be possible without healthy democracies. My conclusion from 30 years of immersion in multilateral climate negotiations and national policy making on the environment is that democratic nations generally lead wherever progress is made. And not always, but generally. In 1941, there were only a dozen democracies. By 2000, only 8 states had never held a serious election. But then came the financial crisis caused by the excesses of rampant capitalism. Democracy has regressed in multiple countries since 2007. And accordingly, failure to protect democracy increasingly means the risk of failure to protect the planet. What has caused this evolution in our society? Worsening inequality is a major factor in the growing threat to democracy. It's fed a rising anger in society. And again, this isn't controversial. It's been measured by many studies. The World Economic Forum even recognizes this. Its Strategic Intelligence Report of June 2021 summarized the core problem: unchecked capitalism, dizzying technological change, grossly disproportionate executive play, and intensive financial globalization. The Inequality Trust, a research body, publishes reams of data that make the problem clear. For example, they plot an index of health and social problems against income inequality. In a group of 21 developed countries, Japan scores best. The USA worse, by far. The UK sits between the two. The inequality problem has implications for communication, as my next learning explains. It seems that new ways of communicating would now seem to be required if support for action on nature is to be built beyond what has been called the liberal elite. In the post-truth world, significant proportions of populations fail to recognize the existential threat that the crisis in nature poses. Worse, many view such denial as an essential element of a belief system that allows them to support rising authoritarian politics. Accordingly, there's a growing line of thought that we who seek action in the crisis in nature must change the way we communicate. And here my lecture overlaps somewhat with Rob's lecture before it. How to do this is the subject of a vital inquest recently published by Systemic, the sustainability think tank. They argue, in essence, that we cannot expect to communicate with people facing the cutting edge of inequality using the language of environmental disaster because they have other, more pressing concerns. The Systemic team sees a need for major reset in our narrative, strategy, and stakeholder capital building, including a new frame for the sustainability agenda, based on the promise of a better life and an abundant, thriving, and safe home for all. This needn't be too difficult, they argue. For example, we have to argue for lower energy bills, not fossil fuel phase-outs. We need to advocate breathable air, not greenhouse gas emission reductions. That way we have a chance of bringing those in denial of the crisis in nature along with us in achieving the outcomes we seek, again, as Rob described in his lecture. 16, building belief that the crisis in nature can be reversed or seriously abated will require examples of how it's done. Holistic solution exemplars, as I think of them, at scale. In my career, I've often witnessed how well exemplars work in laying bare common myths about the supposed unworkability of alternative futures. In the energy field, I'm thinking of residential developments with 100% of electricity and heating coming from renewable micropower, charging electric vehicles, and pointing the way to a future powered by what is increasingly being called electrotech. But these are microcosms, and the crisis in nature needs landscape and national scale exemplars of what a livable world would look and feel like. History gives us licenses to dream this way, to dream big, and the present gives us imperatives to dream even bigger. Just think, 2,000 years ago, somebody persuaded the right people that the aqueduct in the picture could be built, would be investable, and would be a solution to a dire problem 2,000 years ago. They sold an unlikely but essential dream, and they went on to deliver it. This aqueduct and many others like it gave an entire empire access to drinkable water. And so in my final 3 learnings, I turned to solution exemplars. There are so many to choose from in the modern world, and you've heard a few earlier. I will restrict myself to one, and it's my personal favorite. The best solutions exemplar at systems change that I've encountered in 40 years is the notion of the forestry construction pump. This one's not difficult to imagine. Massive forests are planted and are regenerated. They're capable of sucking far more carbon down from the atmosphere than current forests do. They're harvested when mature, in many cases, with 2 vital provisos. First, that more new planting and regeneration takes place than felling. And second, that most of the harvested timber is used in constructing buildings, displacing the concrete, steel, and bricks routinely used by the construction industry. And that is the single biggest source of greenhouse gas on the planet. The resulting timber buildings become an enormous sink for carbon. A previous winner of the Blue Planet Prize, John Schellenhuber, the famous John Schellenhuber, calls this solutions exemplar the forestry construction pump. He's thought through the scale of it. He concludes that, and I quote, by planting and maintaining 500 billion trees and constructing 2 billion timber buildings over a couple of centuries, the atmosphere could be returned to a state not seen since the Industrial Revolution. Just imagine if we even started that, and also Rob's methane campaign, how quickly we could make progress. He knows there's a much more complex detail that would need to be thought through in making that happen. It all sounds very simple, but there will be a lot of interesting discussions in the detail. But the big picture remains clear. Of course, it will not happen this way, he says, but if only half of that is achieved, we can still save the world. I agree. Combining forestry, construction, and biodiversity stewardship in strategy is an area where Japan leads most other nations. The Satayama landscape tradition combines human settlements with adjacent forests, fields, and waters in a high biodiversity socio-ecological system. It very much helps to show the way. That's John Schellenhuber's quote. There are other reasons why this all makes sense. Many nations have housing crises, and traditional construction cannot be the answer, given that 40% of all global emissions derive from that. In Scotland, for example, the government speaks of a national housing emergency, and it will not meet its ambitious targets to reverse biodiversity collapse unless it can house a rural workforce affordably. Off-site manufactured timber panels can be flat-packed and assembled into affordable homes built to Passive House standard or close to it in just days. As many timber buildings as possible should reach this standard because of the benefits they bring for prosperity. Again, Japan helps show the way here with its existing timber policy tools, including public acceptance of wood, mid-rise buildings, and municipal Passive House pilots. But we can turn this into an idea for our times. The forestry construction pump can be communicated not as a carbon pump, as a climate imperative, but as a prosperity pump that can deal with inequality, the nature prosperity pump as I think about it. We combine John Schellenhuber's idea of the forestry carbon pump with the systemic team's conclusion that we have to communicate in new ways in the post-truth world. I think this is quite easy to do in the context of this particular solutions exemplar. Among other things, the solution creates jobs and salaries, reviving rural economies, affordable homes in a time of national housing emergency, lower or even no energy bills in a cost of living crisis, and community income from monetized natural capital as the nature recovery market emerges from within and around the woods. It also saves spending on electricity network upkeep, horrendously expensive that, and supply. And national overdependence on oil and gas, that's the stuff that provides aggressors with the money for their weaponry. Healthcare spending because of the multiple benefits of timber and Passive House design, all this boosts prosperity significantly. So let's call it a nature prosperity pump. And if we're talking to an audience that does not want to be lectured about climate change or even hear about it, we do not even have to add that it would achieve major carbon emissions from averted conventional homes. Final learning before I conclude. How might we bring one of these nature prosperity pumps into existence? One idea is that players most threatened by the crisis in nature lead by example. So For example, a front runner or runners would create a big fund big enough to kickstart a nature recovery market, integrating timber construction, triggering wider investment and exponential growth. I think, based on my experience of what can be done with different sums of capital, that $1 billion might actually be enough to do this. So one possible combination might involve four parties investing 250 million or thereabouts each. And there are many other routes available, but this one would do the job, I think, particularly well. An insurer or a reinsurer, knowing that they face potentially being unable to operate in an uninsurable world if nothing is done. A major retailer, reliant on timber with global interests in both forest land creation and innovative timber products for homes, might be the second candidate. The third candidate might be a multinational conglomerate with multiple supply chains, including in food production, easy to think of. And then a state pension fund thrown in with obvious interests in building a profitable market vital for a livable future for people to retire into. With that vision of a collaborative strategy for survival in the business world, I come to my conclusion. The Azati Glass Foundation Environmental Doomsday Clock this year, as in previous years, shows that the world is in the gravest of danger, and that experts know this only too well. But for me, hope does live. It lies in solution exemplars like the ones I've encountered in my vocational life, and exemplars that I can realistically dream of based on those encounters, like the one I have described, and like the several that Rob described. For those interested in further detail, I describe in an annex to this presentation how a nature prosperity pump exemplar could be brought to life in one nation of 5 million people. That's the place I now live, Scotland. Thank you very much for your attention.